highly significant effects, and for those of you that dabble in effect sizes, they're large by social science standards. I think they're in the 0.6 region. All right, so then we said, okay, when people are asked to think about dying, they want to fly. All right, now here's where it gets interesting, because then what we thought is, all right, let's turn this around a little bit, because if the desire to fly is in some way, psychologically speaking, a reaction to concerns about mortality, then let's ask people to imagine themselves flying, and let's see if imagining yourself being airborne renders you less defensive if you're subsequently reminded of your death. And now here I'm running the risk of being dangerously pedantic late in the day. Did that make sense? I'll say that again because this is important. Okay, so now what we're saying is, hey, if flying has something to do with giving you a sense of invincibility and immortality, then if we could get people to imagine themselves airborne, that should take some of the edge off death, metaphorically speaking. All right, so experiment number 2. We call it Dreaming of Immortality in a Thatched Cottage. The reason we call it that is because what got us going on this was a Chinese lithograph called Dreaming of Immortality in a Thatched Cottage. And you'll see it in a moment because there's a crappy reproduction on the next page. But bottom line is we saw this lithograph. And you'll see in a moment. So here's what we did. Same as the first study. We got a group of people. We asked half of them to think about dying. We asked the other half to think about being in pain. And then we did these things that are called guided imagery exercises. I know, again, that a lot of you work in mental health. Who's familiar with this notion of guided imagery? It's really quite fun, actually. And we divided the people in half. And some of them, we just said, hey, we want you to close your eyes, and we want you to imagine yourself flying. And we gave them the instructions you see on the bottom of page 4. Imagine yourself, the trees ruffle as you soar above the mountaintops. Snow-capped mountains spring up all around as you fly above. You can read the other things. It's quite uplifting, frankly. And basically, we wanted to get people to imagine themselves flying. All right, next page, page 5. Then we needed a control condition where people were on the ground but also thinking they're moving. So now we said, hey, imagine that you're hanging out on the ground. Now visualize the sun rising, the sky clearing. So note, for those of you that are methodologically rigorous, as you should be, both conditions equally vivid, equal in terms of the perception of movement. The only difference is that in one condition you're thinking you're in the air, and in the other you're thinking you're on the ground. How's that sound? How am I doing so far? Then what we did, just to make this, to augment or bolster the impact of this manipulation, I wish I had a better reproduction, but this is a crappy reproduction of the lithograph that I told you about, Dreaming of Immortality in a Thatched Cottage. And you got to have eyesight better than mine to see that in the right there's a little hut, and in a little hut is a guy sitting there. You can see that maybe on the bottom picture. Can folks see that? Right, and then if we had a real copy of this, you see the guy's mirror image floating in the mist in the valley. How many of you can see that? And all we did was the folks that we had just asked to think of themselves flying, we then said, look at this lithograph and imagine that you're the guy floating in the valley. The people that we asked to imagine themselves being on the ground, we said, imagine you're the dude in the hut. All right, they saw exactly the same picture, but they were asked to imagine themselves in different positions. All right, then what we did, now we're on bottom of page 5 and beginning of page 6. All right, then what we did was to ask them, this study was done in 2004. As you know, the invasion of Iraq had taken place in 2003. We asked them to read a little blurb about President Bush and his policies in Iraq. The reason that we did that, and some of you have heard me talk about this in other venues, is that we had done research showing that reminders of death made Americans across the political spectrum more favorable in their evaluations of President Bush and his policies in Iraq. All right, now this talk has nothing to do with that, except that we wanted to use that as our measure of what we call worldview defense. And basically what we predicted was that when people imagine themselves on the ground, that we would get what we had gotten in our other studies, which is that a reminder of death would produce an exponentially more affectionate reaction to the president and his policies in Iraq. But if imagining yourself flying has a palliative effect with regard to taking the edge off reminders of death, that effect should be eliminated. Right? How does that sound? Does that make some sense? Right? And it turns out that that's exactly what we found. On the left, in this so-called grounded condition, we found that reminders of death produced increases in Americans' support for President Bush and his policies in Iraq. That effect was completely eliminated when we asked people to imagine themselves flying. Now again, I don't want to tax your patience too much. For those of you that were not here when I talked about this line of inquiry, I want there to be no misunderstandings. It was not our point in this line of research to suggest that anyone who happens to support President Bush is doing so for defensive reasons. Our concern was just to establish that for some individuals at least, that a reminder of mortality would produce a rather radical alteration in their political sensibilities. But in the context of this study, it was just there to demonstrate that under controlled conditions you would get a mortality salience effect, but under conditions where you imagined yourself in flight, that would disappear. All right, how's that seem? All right, well, fine. That's a parlor game. So what? How do we know if this has any truly potential clinical significance? So we did a third study, and this is the one that excites me most because I do believe that it has practical applications. In this particular study, what we did, it's the same exact study. We asked some people to think about death. We asked other people to think about being in pain. We asked some people to think about flying. We asked other people to think about being on the ground. But instead of asking people what they thought about President Bush, in this study, we asked them to reflect on their experiences of the events of September 11th. This was done, in 2003. And all of the people in this study were within a 5-mile radius of the World Trade Center that day. So we presumed, and it is well known, that people in and around Manhattan were traumatized by the events of September 11th. And we administered what's called a retrospective measure of peri-traumatic dissociation. Dissociation, as the psychological druids know, it is just a state of psychological affairs where in response to trauma, you literally bail on yourself. You just basically, it is so traumatic that you take a break from yourself. People who report being highly dissociated will say, I blanked out, or I felt that I was not part of what was going on. The reason that dissociation is so important, and the clinicians that are here know this better than I, is that it is the single best predictor of the subsequent development of PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. So people who report high levels of dissociation at the time of trauma, or even retrospectively years later,